que hacía falta que le agregaran. Sí, yo creo que ya.
That are happening now. We hope that they continue after the conferences, that we can keep in touch and expand on each other's projects and collaborate. So we will be presenting the panelists for our second panel. I am Diomelka Rivas. I'm a research fellow at CLACLS. And so for our second panel, we have titled it or named it Ecocritical Approaches to Latin America. And so our presenters or our panelists are Phoenix Paz, who is a second-year student in the PhD program in history at the GC, where she researches the history of transportation infrastructure and nation building in Colombia at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. She teaches a course in the history of infrastructure at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and is a co-chair of the Global Capitalism's Reading Group at the Graduate Center. Next, we have Andrés Avila Castillo, who is a Colombian forest engineer and second-year PhD student in the Biology Plant Sciences program at CUNY. His research interests are in systematics and biogeography of neotropical vascular plants, especially in the northern South American composite, the daisy family, and the Proteales. He has mostly worked in several botanic gardens, including Bogota, Cartagena, Medellin, and in the UK, in conservation, living collections, and editorial and taxonomy. Next, we have Cathryn Jijon, who is a PhD student in art history at the Graduate Center, CUNY, where she researches modern and contemporary art of the Americas through the decolonial and ecocritical lens. Currently, she's working on developing a dissertation that examines the art and visual culture surrounding the Amazon in the 20th and 21st centuries. And last but not least, we have Pere Nogues Martin, who sent a video of his presentation because he won't be able to join us today in person because he's conducting research at the moment. And so Pere is a Spanish PhD candidate in cultural anthropology at the Graduate Center, CUNY. His doctoral dissertation explores the role of scientific knowledge production in the making of Bolivia's Uyuni salt flat, a lithium frontier, and also in questioning the current mining practices and fostering identity demands. His research has been supported by La Caixa Foundation, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies, and the Provost Office at CUNY. He has worked on rural development and wastewater treatment projects in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Turkey, and in humanitarian consultancy in Belgium. And that's all of our presenters for our second panel. Let's give them a round of applause.
Hello, my name is Phoenix Paz, and I'm so excited to be here today to share with you my first encounter with the archives and my first exploration and deep dive into all of the historical research. Oh, goodness. No, microphones scare me, so I'm good with this one. And all of my first delve into the archives in Colombia. So this summer, from June 13th through August 16th, I went to Colombia and I went to 5 different cities to look at transit infrastructures. I went to Bogota, then to Honda. I went up the Magdalena River on a bus to see Puerto Berrío, and then I went inland towards Antioquia and visited Cisneros and finished in Medellin. Part of the idea was to understand what are the different transit infrastructures that are available in Colombia and how have they been historically constructed. So I wanted to check out several different types of infrastructures. Most importantly for me is railroad infrastructure, but also looking at river ports and steamboat, and also roads and telecommunication systems, looking at what remains of telegraph communications, of different telephone communications, and of cellular data. So this picture here, you can see it is in Puerto Berrío. It is the new highway that connects Antioquia con Santander. And here you can see the electricity pylon that also serves as a cellular data tower. I divided my research into 3 different types of activities. So 1, I went to different archives. 2, I went to different museums. And 3, I went to the different sites where infrastructure was constructed throughout time. The main archives that I visited included the Biblioteca Luis Ángel Arango in Bogotá, the Biblioteca Nacional, also in Bogotá, and the Centro Cultural de Honda in Honda. All of these different archives have also the records from different train companies that were active both in Bogotá, in all of Cundinamarca, and along the Magdalena and the Magdalena Medio. I went to various museums, also in Bogotá, in Honda, in Medellin, Puerto Berrío, and Cisneros, to see how different transit infrastructures have been presented and portrayed in artistic representations of Colombian history. And then again, I went to the different sites. The most important sites that I went to was the stations for the Tren de Sabana, the Tren de Honda. Also, I did a paseo for all of Puerto Berrío, where I saw Estación Grecia, which is an abandoned station, and the station at Honda. And also the Túnel de la Quiebra, which was the largest tunnel constructed in Colombia throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century. The most important part, what did I learn? I'd like to divide this section into 4 parts, and these are paintings by Humberto Chavez, which I think represent each of the different themes that I took away from my research this summer. The first theme that I want to talk about is trains as symbols of political promise and of development and what this means. The second is the financing of trains and the question of trains as technologies, and how does this develop and what does it mean for technological understandings of infrastructure in general. The third question is trains and railroads as sources of economic development or as economic drivers. And the last is trains as social spaces. So those are the things that I'll talk about. So thinking about trains as political promise, my research led to a couple of different questions. And one is, what is the symbolic role of trains and why are they more important or considered to be privileged over other types of transit infrastructures? And this is a question that started coming up the more and more I see about it, because trains, more than any other type of transit infrastructures, are associated with progress. And while this has come up, it is something I'd like to continue to research and find out more about. So then the other question is, how are trains financed? They're always financed in joint contribution between the national government, the departmental government, and also other investors from abroad. So what sort of political compromises are needed in order to realize or to achieve these different infrastructures? What are the compromises between the departments and the national government? And what are the compromises between national interests and international interests? And how does that affect where trains are laid? What are they doing? Are they passenger trains or freight trains? And all of this will depend on what the trains are supposed to do for the nation politically. Who supports train development and railroad development, and who opposes it? Oftentimes you'll see that Colombia is multimodal. It has multiple transportation infrastructures that are being constructed at the same time. And so you'll have certain actors who favor road construction or who favor steamboat development and the building of canals, and others who support railroad development. And never do they actually talk to one another and think about how these things intersect. So it's going to be really fun to continue to look into who's supporting which infrastructure and why, and how does one development, one project get privileged over another, and in which part of the country, and whether or not this has ecological components or if it's more of a social or economic force that leads to this privileging. And then my last question is thinking about train accidents. And are train accidents published and used to criticize train development or technological development? Are they used to critique this idea of progress and nationhood? How are the portrayal of train accidents used to make a political statement? In the example of Mexico, you see how train accidents are galvanized to critique the Porfiriato throughout the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century. And so I want to see if there's a similar phenomenon in Colombia, or if it's an entirely different way of thinking about accidents. So then the second part is thinking about trains as technology. And one of my favorite things that I found in the archives were the annals of the Colombian Society of Engineers. And one of the things that's really fascinating about it is you can see that trains are still really new technologies. And it's not simply that a train is imported with the whole system and it's planted here. They're being debated, they're being critiqued, new things are being worked out. This one is one of my favorite diagrams because it's showing like, okay, how do you distribute load? Does load change if you make your rail taller or fatter? How does this shake the train? What happens to the engine or the boiler when the train is being shook? So all of these things are debates and are experiments that Colombian engineers are doing. So one of the things that I think is really fascinating that I'd like to continue to research and continue to read through the annals of engineering is to understand how Colombian developments in train technologies continue to affect world development of train technologies and railroad technologies. And then other questions about how do you bring these technologies into Colombia? My favorite was that picture where we saw the train engine being brought on oxen back, right? So the existence of multiple technologies at the same time that are always working together. And all of these things challenge our idea of linear progress where one technology just replaces the other. And then here you can see all of the other infrastructures that are needed to support a railroad. So you see bridges, you see retaining walls, you see tunnels. And I think that these are really fascinating to think that an infrastructure can't just be placed on the landscape. It has to develop the landscape as well. We can also think about trains and transport as one form of economic development, and also the question of labor as the second form of economic development. So when we think about transit and transport, we want to think about what is privileged. Is it passenger service? Is it freight service? What revenue is generated? Is there smuggling going on? Are these trains attacked? Is there a big economy based around this freight? Or is the main economy the labor economy? So who's working on trains? Is there a racial, an ethnic, a gendered component to this? And then what sort of other secondary labors are needed to sustain train development? And these are some of my favorite pictures that I took. I love these pictures of these ladies who are actually school teachers, and they're teaching the engineers' kids. So you can start to see that these aren't just workplaces, but they're also places where people live and they have families. And then here at the bottom, you can see the entire crew for the development of the Túnel de la Quiebra. And then the last thing is to think about trains as social spaces, to think about how social differentiation is continued even on board. What is the purpose of buying a first class, second class, and third class train? And then what sort of secondary economies are generated to increase sociality in the actual spaces? And then when I went to the historical sites, I noticed a couple of different things. A bunch of the train stations have been abandoned. So this led me to a brand new question of what are the social and ecological consequences when an infrastructure is no longer in use? What happens when it's abandoned? And this is at the Estación Grecia in Puerto del Rio. And this is Honda and the big train station there. There are two pictures of the train station because a family of displaced people and refugees from the conflict went and started squatting, and they've redeveloped the train station into their home. And the city was like, well, they've done a nice job. It looks better painted white and blue than it does in the way that we've done it. So they've allowed the family to claim title to it. So thinking about new uses. And then the last question is revitalization. And nowadays in Colombia, there's increasing interest in revitalizing the train structures, not only as freight, but also as tourism and sites of entertainment. So I want us to start thinking about what does it mean for technological tourism or educational tourism as a growing form of economic development, and whether or not this can be a new way to think about trains. So thank you, thank you. I'd like to thank CLACLS, and I'd like to thank the Department of History. Thank you.
So you can use the clicker if you want, or you can come here. However, it's better for you.
Well, thank you for coming and waiting for this presentation. This is a little bit more rigid in the sense of I'm from the biology program, and this is I wanted to connect a little bit with the mission of the CLACLS in the sense of conservation and which are the people's connected with natural areas, and also to the family that I'm studying here in the PhD. I want to understand in this chapter which are the patterns of distribution of this family, and I wanted to show part of the of the plans that I found in this summer. So this is the group of study. This is the Daisies family, Asteraceae of composite. This is the general perspective of the phylogeny of the family. These are all the flowering plants, and the Asteraceae like at the bottom of this image, which is showing that it's a very recent family in the world in terms of evolution. These are like the general plants that you can identify as Asteraceae, sunflower, artichokes, some gerberas, and also if you're from Colombia or maybe some areas, there is like these frailejones, which are like very important plants for conservation. This is like a very flag species. There's a bunch of species, and it is very important in terms of conservation for the Andes. So the general perspective to understand what is an Asteraceae, this is like the dissection of one capitulum, which is the structure of how the flowers are organized in the in the stem. So when you have like a sunflower, you're gonna find a different set of flowers. So what you have in there is not only one flower, it's just a bunch of flowers with variation from the center to the radius. So what you can find in here is like two types of flowers. There's a lot of variation in the sexuality. And the second characteristics of this group is the synanthary, which means that syn is like when you say synthesis is the union of a thesis. In this case, is the union of anthers. So having a capitulum and having this synanthary is the way to recognize the family. This is one of the most diverse plant in the world. So that's interesting to have it like a group studied in terms of conservation, because you can find different patterns of how this family is changing or responding to different conditions in the world. And the purpose of this summer was to generate like new records in some localities in which there is not a lot of records. So you can see at the top that there is a lot of records of these plants. Those records are deposited in different herbaria around the world. But when you start to zoom in, then you realize that there is a lot of gaps in the information, and then you can start to think which are the new localities that you can find. Why is this important? As I was mentioning, there's importance to have like, I mean, there's different groups that you can study, but in this case, since this is a very widespread family, you can understand how they are responding to different changes caused by humans or maybe just by climate change. These are just some recent news in which people have started to study like these high altitude environments, because these are more susceptible to have affections for climate change. So the first thing that I did was selecting localities. So I wanted to check what was happening in the three streams of the Andes in Colombia. So these are the locations that I visited in this summer. Then I did the field work, which is like going to very far away like localities and try to collect some plants. There is a lot of methodologies to have to preserve the branches of the things that you want to study in herbarium. And you need to process the plants, and you need to go to several drying procedures to be able to analyze them in terms of morphology and probably in terms of molecular data as well. So for the first trip, this is the Eastern Cordillera. So this is a very it was not easy to reach this pattern. I don't know if I can show this video. So this is just to show that there is a lot of logistics to reach these areas. So you need to go like by car or sometimes by mules to reach this area. So the first picture is a lot of coffee plantations, which are surrounding the native forests. And those are some of the collections that I found for the first trip. In the central one is a similar scenario. So you can see like there is some plantations and there is a lot of wood logging. Also, again, the motorcycle to reach some far areas. And this is a nice finding. I was able to visit a paramo, which is usually like very in the high altitude mountains. But in this case, it was like a very isolated one. It was like very in a lower elevation. Also, the other plant, which is having the purple flowers, might be like a new species for science, and I'm trying to describe it in the next months. Finally, the Western Cordillera. This is so I was planning to go to the south. There is a national park called Muchique. It was not possible to go because of security reasons. So I changed the travel to the Farallones de Cali. And these are like some of the landscapes and some examples of the Asteraceae that I found. So during this, during this expedition, this slide is like a spin-off of the expedition because it's not part of my thesis. I'm not going to understand like what is happening with the affectations of these natural areas. But since I was collecting like nearby these protected areas, I was able to find a lot of pressure and what is happening around the governance of these national parks. So the left one is the Farallones. There is a lot of pressure for mining, gold mining. And the on the right is the Nevado del Huila. There is a lot of pressure in the western slope of the Central Cordillera. There is a lot of violent armed groups, which are now they were cultivating cocaine the last decades, but now they are growing cannabis, and they have like some permits because they have this organization for collective lands. And since these indigenous communities are able to produce like some set of some number of tons of cannabis, they have like some regulation of which communities are selling these cannabis products. But in the eastern slope, there is not the collective titling. There is like just some privates. So there is a lot of conflicts that are surrounding the problems on the natural area. So yeah, going there is like very risky, but this is like the context of the conservation. So the next steps, I'm doing like all the paperwork for the extraction, DNA extraction, and the exportation permits to bring samples in here to make this study possible, and also to reassure that all the local collections will have all the information and all the information that I had in these expeditions. So yeah, this is the final one. Thank you to CLACLS and all of these organizations, and of course to the field guides that were with me in the different expeditions.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about just one of the sites that I went to, but I was able to go to a lot of different places over the summer throughout the Andean region and also in Brazil. Campesinos en problemas por el costo de vida announces a speech bubble that emerges from a man's head at the left of the image. His body, however, is not just a body. His torso transforms into a series of scenes that spiral into the center of the composition, depicting the difficulty of life in Loreto, in the northernmost department in Peru, and part of the country's Amazonian region. Within these scenes, exchanges take place, all centering around money and goods. Working from the head down and counterclockwise, we see two men greeting each other and shaking hands. A man handing money to a vendor selling fish, plantains, and other goods. To the vendor, he says, "Toma mi lintis para el plátano." A mother and child attempting to sell yuca, corn, and rice to a man. The woman, realizing the man is offering her an unreasonably low price, says, "No, señor, el precio no me da para nada." A vendor selling gas, sugar, rice, and other basic goods behind a table points to his wares and says, "Acá tiene lo que va a comprar, amigos." In front of him stand a couple debating what to buy. The man, realizing they can't afford what is being offered, says to his partner, "Mujer, la plata no nos alcanza." A man standing and speaking to a group of 5 people at the Asamblea Campesina, whose hands are raised and appear to be active participants in the discussion, their gazes directed intently at the speaker, who says, Nosotros los campesinos trabajamos y producimos y no sube de precio. His right hand gestures toward the final scene at center, which seemingly illustrates his point. Few people are seen, machetes in hand, laboring in the chacra, most likely working to cultivate many of the goods on sale in the earlier scenes. Made in 1989 by Roldan Murayari Cariwa, an artist from Lucero Pata, Loreto, Campesinos en Problemas por el Costo de Vida speaks to the living conditions of people in the artist community during the 1980s, a period of political instability and economic stagnation in Peru. Murayari's composition highlights the ways the community, depicted as part of a single frustrated body whose livelihood was linked to cultivation of the land, was struggling to make ends meet as a result of inadequate compensation for their labor. Murayari submitted this work to the 1989 edition of the Concurso de Dibujo y Pintura Campesina, a national drawing and painting competition in Peru. 10 competitions were held between 1984 and 1996, with thousands of drawings and paintings submitted by artists from indigenous and rural communities across Peru, including the Amazonian departments of Loreto, San Martin, and Ucayali, and which focus on a variety of topics: experiences in the community, working the land, self-ethnographic explorations of a community's worldview, critiques of working conditions, scenes of political violence, the impacts of political instability, issues of extraction, and so on, and some of which you'll see in this presentation. The submissions by Amazonian artists are the focus of my research, which is still very much in its early stages. I am particularly interested in historicizing the competition, analyzing visually and materially the works produced by the competition's artists, and thinking about these works in relationship to the contemporary artistic production of indigenous Amazonian artists working today in Peru. And so first, I wanted to provide some background on the competition and the archive. The Concurso de Dibujo y Pintura Campesina was in many ways a result of anthropological and NGO interest in Peru's rural and indigenous communities. It was organized by 9 NGOs operating in Peru, including the Centro de Educación y Comunicación ILLA, Asociación de Educativos Rurales, and the Centro Peruano de Estudios Sociales. The drawings and paintings submitted to the competition sometimes responded to an explicit theme. So for instance, here you can see a work titled La Mujer Chipiva con Iva, which was responding to the 1996 competition theme, La Mujer y la Vida en el Campo. But as I mentioned earlier, these works often addressed a wide range of topics, even within the themes themselves. In 2004, almost 4,000 works from the Concurso de Dibujo y Pintura Campesina entered into the collection of the Museo de Arte de la Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Lima, Peru, where they are currently held today. UNMSM collaborates with the Lugar de la Memoria, Tolerancia y Inclusión Social, or LUM, also in Lima, which preserves the records and contact information for the artists who submitted to any of the competition's 10 editions. The archive has also participated in several exhibitions, including Imágenes de la Tierra, Archivo de Pintura Campesina at the Museo de Arte de San Marcos in 2006. And so this summer, with generous funding I received from the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the Grad Center, I was able to travel to Lima to visit the Archivo de Dibujo y Pintura Campesina at UNMSM in order to gain a better understanding of the materials in the collection that come from artists living in the Peruvian Amazon. Unfortunately, no pictures were allowed, but a handful of the works are digitized online. And this is me after looking at the archive. And so little scholarship exists on the competition and archive, particularly from an art historical perspective. Recently, Cristiana Alexander Elguera Ortolegui has studied the 1996 competition, discussing the visual acts of resistance and translation enacted by women artists from the highlands, but a study that looks specifically at the Amazon, as far as I can tell, has yet to be written. But I first became interested in the competition while reading the scholarship of Peruvian art historian and curator Maria Eugenia Ilia, who I was also able to meet while I was in Lima. And she was working on the Borda artist, Victor Churay Roque, who's one of the most recognized artists from the Peruvian Amazon and who also participated in the 1994 and 95 editions of the competition, ultimately winning. And so you can see his work here. Ilia Ilia's work on Jurai focuses in part on the exploration of yanchama as a support for Amazonian artists. Yanchama is a natural fiber that comes from a variety of trees found in the Amazon rainforest, and though traditionally used to make clothing, crowns, and masks, beginning in the 1980s, painting on yanchama also became increasingly popular. Ilia links this to the increased presence of tourism, NGOs, and anthropologists in the Peruvian Amazon, as well as knowledge within the region of the early iterations of the competition. And yanchama remains a popular support today for painters from the region, including the Huitoto and Bora artist Santiago Yahuarcani, who has become increasingly popular in Peru and internationally. While in Lima, I was able to visit Yahuarcani's gallery, Crisis Galeria, and this is a photo from the visit. And also able to see an exhibition of Yahuarcanis at the Centro Cultural Inca Garcilaso in Lima. Critically, the Concurso de Dibujo y Pintura Campesina also essentially kind of opened up the museum and gallery world in Lima to artists from the Amazon. And the 1990s and early 2000s saw a number of exhibitions dedicated to Amazonian artists, such as El Medio Ecológico de la Cuenca del Ampillacu and El Encanto de la Selva y los Mitos Amazónicos at the Galería Formas de Miraflores in 97 and 98. And as well as El Ojo Verde, Cosmovisiones Amazónicas at the Fundación Telefónica in 2000. In this way, I see the Concurso de Dibujo y Pintura Campesina and the later Concurso de Pintura Nativa as playing a critical role in the amplification of indigenous Amazonian art in Peru, in addition to art from other regions as well. As Ilia notes, it helped inaugurate yanchama as a support that continues to be used today by Amazonian artists. Within Amazonian communities, the competition also served as an important vehicle of visibility and amplification for artists like Jurai, while also enabling the dissemination of rural indigenous art within communities themselves, since SER, one of the organizations that, or one of the NGOs that organized the competition, organized traveling exhibitions featuring the competition's winners in order to promote subsequent open calls. So essentially, I'm interested in the ways that we can historicize contemporary artistic production of Amazonian artists from Peru and the ways that they articulate anti-colonial, anti-extractive critique and territorial sovereignty visually through the national drawing and painting competitions, and the ways that these modes of historical visual critique then link to contemporary artistic production. This question arose for me after visiting several exhibitions, either dealing explicitly with Amazonian art or in which Amazonian artists were featured, and noticing that they all largely appeared to be working in the 21st century. In terms of next steps for the project, I hope to return to Peru and conduct interviews with contemporary artists, as well as with the artists who participated in the competition, drawing on Loom's records in order to be able to better analyze and historicize the artwork submitted to the competition and look for linkages, material, formal, thematic, and theoretical, between the works made for the competition and those made today. Thanks. Thank you. We are now going to run a video that discussing these research findings.
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna open the panel for Q&A. If you have any questions. Okay.
Anyone has questions for them? Amazing. I'm just, it's just very interesting. I know a lot of the topics. So I'm not sure if I'm gonna contribute to many, but I hope so. If not, we'll continue our conversation over lunch. There will be food downstairs, not lunch, but some food if you want at our office. So please, you know how much I love your research at this point. But my brain works in a very strange way. So while you were speaking, I was thinking of the origins of the word sabotage and sabot, shoe, and how people sometimes threw them through shoes in railway roads as a form of sabotage or demonstrating against the system. And that took me to the parts attacking railroads and how common that was, how the attacks to infrastructure. I know this is not a period of research, but I was wondering, during your period, were rail, because back then during your period, they were the basic Colombia, right? The heart of Colombia was its railroad structure. So how important that was and how much of place for actions of resistance to the nation building and to the state of Colombia itself were connected to railroads. Fabio, I first wanted to acknowledge how great you are in explaining to people who have no idea about what you're talking about. You make me feel like I understand everything about my life. I go home now and say, well, you're a gardener, but I know what a flower is, or flowers, we want flowers. Thank you so much for that. You've also made me think about the challenges of field research and things that sometimes we don't acknowledge, like, oh, give your receipts, and you're taking a mute to get to your point where you have to do your field research. So I really appreciate you doing that, and I can see your work actually receiving a lot of support. This is crucial in our time. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. I was just wondering to what extent the generation of new records is an important thing for you, because sometimes I'm a historian. So as historians, we're looking at old records that were generated. We're not generating new stuff. We're basically building and engaging. Of course, we're engaging with sources. We are revisiting the sources, reinventing, reshaping the sources, but we're not generating knowledge. So I'm going to just understand to what extent your work is connecting with what is there, and to what extent it is connecting to generating new sources, not only sources, but new resources, new materials for that. Especially because in your field nowadays, it feels like in the past 5 years, everything has changed, right? And now I understand plans as things to communicate or in constant conversation and all of that. So I was just wondering to what extent this generation of knowledge is an important part of your research. And Cathryn, this is so fascinating. I also wanted, if possible, to understand how you frame this in your dissertation. Because I was waiting with the cosmopolitanes, for me, they were like, oh, that's an entire new project. And I was wondering if cosmopolitanes or shamanic visions too are part of what you're doing, like, is it a chapter, or you're not framing it that way, it's just the art and all of that. And I was curious to know if you're conducting interviews with the artists. And if you want, if they see themselves as artists, or if they see themselves as campesinos or indigenous peoples, or how do they see themselves in terms of having their work in museums and being artists or not. So I'm really fascinating job. And I just wanted to acknowledge the who put together the events, because sometimes we go to conferences, I say that we present the people who have no connection with us. And so I'm like, oh man, I'm finished, but we're talking about something so foreign. This is, I think you all can be, connecting and exchanging ideas, because everything is so close. Oh, I forgot the one thing that I was going to say to you, Cathryn, too, because I said that land is an essential question to all of you. And you mentioned, I was wondering too, because I was talking, because my brain is crazy. When I was thinking about genetic visions, I was also thinking about Pachamama and how many of those drawings are connected to the idea of Pachamama that is so important for Peruvians too. But that's not part of the legal framework in Peru as it is in Bolivia or another place. It's not, I think it has been part of the legal framing in the country or the discussion or, this is just an individual's law and that's where it stands. I'm just looking for that too, if you know about it.
So the question of sabotage and the way that it's used to generate political response is really, really fascinating. And I read in Alfonso Monera, and he's like, during the War of the 1,000 Days, rails were torn up, and then the steel was converted into bullets because there wasn't enough bullets. However, he doesn't cite where he gets that information. And I talked to other historians, and they're like, no, it didn't happen. So this is something that I definitely want to take a look at and see, are railways sabotaged for military movements during the end of the 19th and early 20th century? Or were they attacked for access to whatever is being transported on them, or other things like that? How were they sabotaged if they were? And I went to the archivists and I was like, so I'm really interested in railway accidents and in sabotage and in contraband and things like that. And they were like, ooh, you're one of those disaster kind of people, huh? And I was like, well, no, I think that there's a really if these accidents are purposefully created, then it's saying something about the way people perceive technology. And they were like, I don't know. So one of the things that I want to do this year is take a look through the archives that I have and see, does accident reporting happen? Are there reports of sabotage? Are there reports of things being stopped? Is there reports of contraband? And looking at newspapers or court cases or letters to the companies, because when I just asked about it, people were like, you're nuts. So thinking about how do I approach it? What sort of keywords do I look for? Do I just read everything and try to pick it up? So it's definitely something that's also on my mind.
That's basically a newspaper, and newspapers are going to be the way to go to.
Yeah.
Right, probably, as I said, communication networks or with.
Yeah, and thinking about are there emergency telegraphs and maybe the telegraphs get sabotaged, whereas the railways themselves don't. So thinking about what are the infrastructures that get sabotaged, and where they do. What I think is kind of interesting is the idea of industrial sabotage, and possibly people who are supporting canals or steamways being like, no, let's make it impassable for railways. Or does something happen there? Because there's very clearly major tensions and people are really mean to one another. So seeing how this turns out and seeing if this is different between political sabotage or industrial sabotage, things like that. So yes, it's on my mind and I don't have an answer yet.
It's an interesting question because when you're manipulating all of these records, you need to clean all of this data and you need to have a personal experience or perspective of what is happening with this data. So if you're able to create new things according to the knowledge that you have, maybe you are comparing some records from the last century and the last decade and new things, you're able to say why this person was thinking that this flower was this, but I think with the new knowledge that we have that he was or she was incorrect in the past. So sometimes you can work with the data that is available and to say it's happening something. But when you are producing new data, new records, you are able to transform or to controvert the information that was already created. So maybe someone was saying that sunflowers were red in the past, but now you are going to the field and you are seeing that, no, this is yellow. So then you need to change all of these records and the new information is going to be like this is yellow flowers for that. So you're able to change because you have like new knowledge interacting with all of these historical records. That is happening in all the databases, and also those records are connected to the archival work, which is the botanical specimens in all the herbaria.
Thank you for your questions. So in terms of the first question around framing of the dissertation and the cosmovision, I'm still really at the early phases. So I am not sure necessarily how this project works in terms of it being a chapter or something larger. But I think exactly what you said, even in looking at these materials that are dealing more with critiques around the extraction of labor, the extraction of resources, because it's also intimately tied to the land. Of course, questions of worldview and the cosmovision are completely present there as well. And so, I mean, that's part of the reason why I really want to conduct interviews, is to understand how people were thinking about what they were drawing or painting at that time, because I think it's all, I think you can't separate these critiques of different forms of extraction from how people relate to their land and to their community and to their own histories. So that's something I'm still trying to figure out how to work with. And then in terms of conducting interviews with the artists and how they see themselves, you know, it's something that I was thinking a lot about for the research that I was doing in Peru, and then also some of the materials that I was looking at in Ecuador, because there's this, not tension, but just a thing to deal with in terms of the relationship between like art history and anthropology and these divisions that have been drawn, and what gets considered anthropological or ethnographic material versus what gets considered art, and who's considered an artisan versus an artist, right? Like all of these different boundaries that have been drawn. And so again, I think because I don't love the hierarchy, I tend to refer to them, to the cultural producers, as artists. But in conversation, if someone were to say, like, I don't consider myself an artist, I would not refer to them as an artist. But for someone like Santiago Yawarkani, who has gallery representation, he was just in like a fair in Europe. And so I feel like definitely very much considers himself to be an artist. And then the legal frameworks on Pachamama in Peru, I'm not sure. I don't think there are protections in the same way that there are like in Ecuador, but even in Ecuador, right, like you have the rights of nature that's built into the Constitution, but oftentimes it's kind of symbolic. Like it was important for it to be put into the Constitution, but you still see communities struggling and fighting against the government, like basically nonstop, for the protections that should be afforded to them and to the land in the Constitution. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we have, you're ready. So. And then we'll go downstairs to the class. We have to do, you know,
I think it doesn't help. The sound is not working. I was able to listen to it yesterday. Audio. Increase volume.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank the CLACLS for the support. It was very important to my research. I mentioned the video is running well, and you can also.
Yeah. So it's gonna take a long time to stop.
The fellowship, I was able to do a lot of research, and I'll tell you more in person eventually. I know it's probably starting now.
I don't think we'll be able to play.
My other
We can go, yeah.
We can go. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you.
There you go. Now you got it.
But it's, oh, it's from here.
We're gonna sneak behind you.
Looking for presentations about lithium and the sulfate and thus their development and
Oye, felicitaciones. Bien, ¿y tú?
Bien.
No te conocía el Fabio. Ah. No, ese video de... No encuentro. Ese video de... Si lo share, ¿no? Yo solo saber si estoy grabando. Estoy haciendo ya.